This isn't a knitting circle. Move, Grandma! The young firefighter was yelling, his face red and tight with adrenaline as he tried to push me away from the scene. He thought he was saving a confused old woman from the flames, but I was the only one there who knew the truth. This fire wasn't an accident, and the smoke was telling me exactly who lit the match. The air tasted like hot metal and wet ash. Sirens wailed, a constant scream that vibrated in my teeth, but I had learned long ago to turn down the volume in my own head. I stood behind the yellow tape, a good, safe distance, and just watched. The fire was loud. It was a roar, a deep-throated beast inside the tall glass building. It punctuated its anger with the sharp crackle of shattering windows. Firefighters yelled, their voices muffled by masks and adrenaline. They were all focused on the bright orange flames, the beautiful, destructive part of the fire. I wasn't. I was watching the smoke. Flames are emotional. They are dramatic and terrifying, and they get all the attention. But smoke tells the truth. It's the building's last confession. This smoke was a liar, for a fire this large. In a modern office building full of plastics, cheap desks, and synthetic carpets, the smoke should have been thick, black, and greasy. It should have been heavy, choking stuff. This smoke was different. It was pale gray, almost white, and it was moving too fast, punching out of the windows with a force that didn't match the flames I could see. It didn't smell right either. Underneath the scent of burnt carpet, there was a sharper, cleaner smell, almost like a sparkler on the 4th of July. That's when I heard the pounding footsteps on the pavement, coming up fast behind me. "Ma'am, get out of here!" a voice yelled, high and tight with adrenaline. I didn't turn. This isn't a knitting circle. "Move, Grandma!" A hand, covered in a heavy, fire-resistant glove, reached for my arm. He was about to physically push me. I still didn't look at him. My eyes were fixed on the 7th floor, where the smoke was the palest. "It's Arson," I said, my voice quiet but clear in a brief lull between sirens. "The smoke is the wrong color." He let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Sure, lady. Now move, Miller." A different voice bellowed, heavy with exhaustion and authority. We were interrupted by another set of footsteps, these ones slower, more deliberate. I recognized the heavy tread of Chief Davies. I'd known him since he was a rookie himself, back when I still worked in a proper lab and not just from my living room. He stopped beside us, his face grimed with soot. He looked older than I remembered from our last call, 6 months ago. The fire was wearing him down. "Miller, what are you doing?" Davies snapped. "Sir, this woman won't move." "She's in the way," the rookie, Miller, said, puffing up his chest. Chief Davies finally looked away from the burning building and saw me. His entire body seemed to change. The tension in his shoulders dropped, replaced by a deep, profound relief. "Evelyn," he said, and the name sounded like an exhale. "Dr. Hess, thank God you're here. The press is calling it faulty wiring." I finally turned my head, just enough to look at the chief. "It's not faulty wiring, Chief. It's an accelerant. Something with a magnesium base. That's why the smoke is pale gray instead of black. It's burning far too hot for simple wiring." Davies nodded slowly, soaking it in. Then he turned his head and pinned the young firefighter with a look that could have melted steel. "This Grandma," Davies said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, "is Dr. Hess. She's the best arson investigator in the country. She wrote the manual you were supposed to read in the academy. The one on chemical fires?" He paused, letting the words hang in the smoky air. "Now shut up, stand back and learn something." I watched the young man's face. It was a fascinating transformation. It went from the bright, confident red of adrenaline to a sickly, pale white. He looked at me, then at the chief, then back at me. He looked mortified. I finally turned and looked at him. Really looked at him. He was just a kid, playing a part, trying to be the hero in the story. I gave him a mild, neutral look, maybe a little softer than I intended. Then I walked past him, stepping under the tape as Chief Davies held it up for me. The fire was still roaring, but the real investigation was just beginning. This fire was a story, and someone had tried to burn the first, most important chapter. My job was to read the ashes. Hours later, the world had shrunk to a conference room in a hotel across the street. The roar of the fire was gone, replaced by the low hum of a ventilation system and the distant, muffled whine of water pumps. The air smelled of stale coffee and the damp, sooty scent clinging to my clothes. I had swapped my simple coat for my official investigator's jacket. It was stiff and familiar, a kind of armor I had worn 1,000 times. Chief Davies sat at the head of the long, polished table, his face looking even more tired under the harsh fluorescent lights. Across from us sat Mr. Harrison, the CEO. He was not tired. He was angry. He wore an expensive suit that still looked perfect, and he smelled faintly of sharp, citrusy cologne. A man in an identical suit, his lawyer, sat beside him, saying nothing. "This is an absolute waste of time," Harrison said, clicking a gold pen against the table. Click, click, click. Our internal reports clearly stated the electrical in that building was due for an upgrade. This is a tragedy, not a crime. I should be managing my people, not sitting here. I let the silence stretch for a moment, letting his impatience fill the room. I had a small, heat-sealed bag on the table in front of me. I hadn't opened it. I didn't need to. "The fire didn't start in the electrical room, Mr. Harrison," I said. My voice sounded loud in the quiet room. Harrison stopped clicking his pen. "What?" "The electrical room is in the basement," I continued, looking directly at him. "The fire started on the 12th floor, in the server room to be precise." Chief Davies leaned forward, his elbows on the table. He was watching me, letting me lead. Harrison waved a dismissive hand. "A server overheats, a wire shorts." "It's the same thing." "Faulty equipment." "No," I said. "It wasn't a short. It was started with a custom thermite-style device, placed directly on the server racks." The lawyer stopped shuffling his papers. Harrison's face tightened, his eyes narrowing. "And you know this?" "How?" Harrison scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Did you read tea leaves in the smoke you were staring at?" I thought of Miller, the rookie, and his knitting circle comment. It seemed the wealthy and the young shared the same poor habits of assumption. "No, Mr. Harrison," I said. "I read the concrete." I pushed a photograph across the table. It was a close-up of the floor in the server room, taken just an hour ago. The concrete was deeply pitted with small, crater-like pockmarks. "That," I said, pointing, "is called spalling. It happens when concrete is heated too quickly, too intensely. The moisture inside the concrete turns to steam and explodes, chipping the surface. A simple electrical fire, even one that burns hot, burns slow. It spreads. It doesn't have the focused, immediate, white-hot temperature to do this." I tapped the photo. This wasn't a fire. This was a demolition. It wasn't designed to spread through the building. It was designed to completely and utterly destroy those servers. Harrison stared at the photograph. The color was draining from his face, leaving a pale, waxy shine under the lights. The click of his pen was gone. The only sound was the ventilation. He looked up at me, and for the first time the anger in his eyes was gone. It had been replaced by something else, something cold and sharp. He knew I was right, and now he knew that I knew. The sun was coming up, casting a sick gray light over the city. It had been a long night. The air on the 12th floor was thick and wet. Everything was covered in a layer of black, slimy soot. The smell was overwhelming, wet charcoal, melted plastic, and that same sharp chemical tang from the smoke, now settled and cold. Water dripped from the ceiling in a dozen places, a slow, unsteady drumbeat. Our boots crunched on grit and shattered glass. Behind me, firefighter Miller followed. He was quiet, a perfect shadow in his clean turnout gear. Chief Davies had, as I expected, assigned him to me. It was half punishment, half education. Miller carried my heavy investigation kit, and he carried it stiffly, like he was afraid it might explode. He was trying to be invisible, and mostly succeeding. I walked past the main area of destruction, the open plan office where desks were now just twisted black skeletons. Miller hesitated, clearly thinking this was the main scene. "Here," I said, pointing my flashlight beam toward the server room. I didn't need the light to see, not really. The roof had partially collapsed, letting in that weak morning sky. But the beam focused the attention. Miller followed me into the room. It was a pit. The concrete was exposed, pitted with the spalling I had shown Harrison. The server racks were gone, reduced to heaps of melted metal slag, fused together in grotesque sculptures. The air was hottest here. I could feel the residual warmth through the soles of my boots. Miller just stood in the doorway, his mouth slightly open, taking in the sheer destruction. "It's all gone," he whispered, mostly to himself. Nothing could survive this." He was thorough, I agreed, my voice quiet. I unzipped my jacket and pulled out my own small tools, a scraper, tweezers, and a dozen sterile evidence bags. I handed my flashlight to Miller. "Hold that. Point it where I'm looking." He fumbled it for a second, then held the beam steady. I ignored the big, obvious piles of melted metal. That wasn't the story. That was the cover. I knelt by the warped metal frame of the doorway. The paint had been completely burned away, but there was a faint, powdery residue left behind. I carefully scraped it into a bag, sealed it, and labeled it. Miller watched me, his face a mix of confusion and something else, curiosity. He was starting to see. "Ma'am?" he asked, his voice timid. "What is that?" "Residue from the accelerant," I said, not looking up. "The thermite." It splashed. I moved deeper into the room, over to the largest pile of slag. I walked around it, my eyes scanning the floor, the walls, the debris field. An explosion, even a small, contained one like this, throws things. I was looking for what was thrown, and there it was. Tucked behind a fallen piece of ceiling tile, partially shielded, was a single computer hard drive. It was warped, its plastic casing bubbled and melted, but it hadn't been in the white-hot center. The device had done its job, but the small blast from the chemical reaction had kicked this one free, like a seed popping from a pod. I knelt again, this time with my camera. Click, flash, click, flash. Only then did I carefully pick it up with a gloved hand and place it into its own padded evidence box. Miller had been silent the whole time. Holding the light, I finally stood up, my knees cracking in the damp air. I turned to him, and he flinched as if he was expecting me to scold him. "Dr. Hess?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the dripping water. "I don't understand. What are you looking at?" "Everything is destroyed." I looked at the destroyed room, then back at the young man. He was right. It was a scene of total loss. But he was looking at it the wrong way. "I'm looking at what they didn't burn," I said. "An arsonist is a storyteller. They want you to believe a certain story. A story about faulty wiring, or an accident. They make a lot of noise and a lot of smoke to sell that story." I held up the small sealed box containing the hard drive. But they always get the details wrong. This fire wasn't meant to spread. It was meant to incinerate one specific thing, the servers. I tapped the box. He was good. He was very, very good. But he wasn't perfect. He left a survivor. Miller stared at the box. The light from the flashlight was shaking, just a little. He was finally starting to understand. He wasn't at a fire. He was at a crime scene. We were back in the hotel boardroom. It was the next day, and the bright morning sun streaming through the windows felt wrong, too cheerful. The room was the same, but the energy was entirely different. It was brittle. Chief Davies sat beside me. His face was clean, but the lines around his eyes were deeper. Mr. Harrison and his lawyer were back, and Harrison's anger from the night before had cooled into a hard, polished arrogance. He looked at his watch, a large gold thing. "If you have nothing, Dr. Hess, I'm leaving," Harrison said. His voice was flat. "My board is meeting in an hour, and I have an insurance claim to file." I looked at him. I had my small, padded evidence box on the table in front of me, next to a thin file folder. I took my time, opening the box. "You're right, Mr. Harrison," I said. It wasn't faulty wiring. The lawyer, who had been whispering to Harrison, stopped. "And it wasn't about the insurance," I continued. "Not for the building, anyway." I took a small, sealed plastic bag from the box and placed it gently in the center of the polished table. Inside was a warped, blackened piece of metal, no bigger than my thumb. Harrison squinted at it. "What is that? More of your tea leaves?" "That," I said, "is the housing for a military-grade thermite charge. The lab confirmed my analysis of the residue. You can't buy this at a hardware store. You have to know someone who can get you military surplus." The lawyer's face went very still. He placed a hand on Harrison's arm, but the CEO shook it off. That's insane." "It's conjecture," Harrison said, but a bead of sweat had appeared on his temple. "It's metallurgy," I corrected him. I opened the thin file folder. The lab was also able to recover fragments of data from the hard drive we found. The one that was blown clear. I pushed a single sheet of paper, a printout, across the table. "Your company was 48 hours away from a federal audit. The SEC was investigating you for fraud." Harrison's face, which had been pale, now flushed a dark, ugly red. "That's a lie," he hissed. "Is it?" I slid a second piece of paper over. It was an internal email recovered from the drive. A panicked message from his CFO. I looked him straight in the eye. "The servers on the 12th floor didn't just run the building's air conditioning, Mr. Harrison. They held the real books. The ones you were hiding from the auditors." The room was completely silent. Even the air conditioning hum seemed to have died. Harrison stared at the papers, his mouth opened slightly. The confident, angry CEO was gone. In his place was a cornered man, breathing too fast. Chief Davies just watched him, his expression unreadable. Harrison's face was a mask of disbelief. He looked from me to the chief, then back to the papers on the table. He was searching for an escape route, a way to deny what was right in front of him. "You didn't burn the building down to collect insurance," I said, my voice steady. I was just stating the facts. "You burned the evidence. You were so afraid of getting caught for fraud, you committed a far more serious crime." I leaned forward slightly. "You're just lucky the building was empty, Mr. Harrison. You're lucky no one died. Arson is one thing. Homicide is another." He slammed his hand down on the polished table. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot, making his own lawyer jump. "That's insane," Harrison yelled, his voice cracking. "It's conjecture. You have nothing. You have a melted piece of trash. You have a memo." "This is a witch hunt." "Is it?" I asked. I was not yelling. The SEC audit was triggered by an anonymous whistleblower. Someone who knew exactly where you kept the data. Someone who, I imagine, you were planning to frame for the fraud when you were safely in a country with no extradition treaty. The lawyer, who had been pale, now looked ill. He slowly, deliberately, pushed his chair back from the table, a tiny movement that said, "I am not with him." Harrison didn't seem to notice. His eyes were wild. "I'm a respected businessman. I am the victim here. My building burned down." "And you were prepared for it," I said, delivering the last piece. I looked at Chief Davies. "Chief, I suggest you check Mr. Harrison's financials. I asked the federal investigators to look this morning." I turned back to Harrison. His breathing had stopped. He emptied his personal accounts 2 days ago, transferred everything to an offshore bank. He was planning to run. That was it. The final word. Harrison didn't say anything. He just deflated. The anger, the arrogance, the panic, it all evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, gray-faced man. He sank back into his chair. He looked at his gold watch, then at his hands. He was done. Chief Davies stood up. He didn't look at Harrison. He looked at me, and his eyes were full of a deep, weary gratitude. He gave me a single, slow nod. He pulled a small radio from his belt. "We're good in here," he said into it. The door to the conference room opened. 2 uniformed police officers, not firefighters, stepped inside. They were quiet, professional. They walked behind Harrison, their steps silent on the hotel carpet. "Mr. Harrison," the first officer said, "please stand up. You need to come with us." The lawyer was already packing his briefcase. "Mr. Harrison, I advise you to say nothing." Harrison didn't seem to hear him. He didn't seem to hear anything. He stood up slowly, mechanically, his expensive suit looking suddenly too big for him. As they led him out, he looked at me. His eyes were empty. He had been so focused on the fire he was building, he never imagined someone like me would be there to read the smoke. He never imagined a grandma would be the one to see the truth. He never saw me at all. And that, I thought, was why he was here. The conference room felt suddenly very large and empty. The 2 officers were gone, Harrison was gone, and even the lawyer had slipped away, leaving only a faint, lingering scent of citrus cologne. Chief Davies slumped back into his chair and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. He looked for the first time in 2 days completely exhausted. He was a man who had been running on pure will, and that will had just crossed the finish line. "Evelyn," he said, his voice rough. He didn't look up. "You did good. Again. I don't know what I would have done." "You would have found it eventually, Chief," I said, zipping up my investigation kit. "I just got there a little faster." He let out a short, tired laugh. No, we wouldn't have. We were looking at a fire. You were reading a book. Thank you. Just send me the report when it's closed," I said. It was our old ritual. The official end. I picked up my kit. He nodded, a promise. "Get some rest, Doctor." I walked out of the conference room. The hotel lobby was buzzing with a new kind of energy. Reporters were clustered near the front doors, cameras and microphones at the ready, like birds waiting for a handout. They were all watching the elevators, waiting for the chief of police or maybe even Harrison in handcuffs. Not a single one of them looked at me. I walked right past the cluster. An old woman in a plain coat carrying a bag. I was invisible again, and I was fine with that. I had never liked the cameras. The automatic doors slid open, and I stepped out into the afternoon. The city air felt cool and fresh, even with the usual smell of bus exhaust. The sun was bright, and I had to squint. I had been in the dark, in the smoke and the wreckage, for too long. My car was parked 3 blocks away, an old, reliable sedan that had never let me down. The drive home was quiet. I kept the radio off. The sounds of the city, a distant siren, the rumble of a bus, the chatter of people on the sidewalks were enough. I just drove, watching the world go by, letting the tension of the last 36 hours unwind. My house is small, on a quiet street lined with old trees. The second I opened the front door, the smell of home wrapped around me. It was a mix of old books, lemon polish, and the faint, sweet scent of the jasmine tea I'd left in a canister on the counter. It was the opposite of the fire. It was the smell of peace. I dropped my kit by the door. I took off my investigator's jacket and hung it in the closet next to my winter coat. I didn't want to look at it for a few days. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink, scrubbing for a long time, watching the last of the invisible soot swirl down the drain. I filled my kettle with water and set it on the stove. While it heated, I stood and looked out my window at the small, tidy garden in my backyard. The whistle of the kettle was a sharp, cheerful sound. I made my tea, a dark, fragrant oolong. I poured it into my favorite mug, a heavy ceramic one that warmed my hands. I carried it into the living room and sat down in my armchair, the one with the worn, smooth wooden arms. The house was silent except for the tick of the old clock on the mantel. I looked at my bookshelves, at the rows and rows of manuals, textbooks, and case files. My own name was on the spine of a few of them. To Harrison, I was a grandma. To Miller, a lady who needed to be moved. Here, surrounded by my books, with a warm cup of tea, I was just Evelyn. I took a sip. The tea was hot and clean, and it washed away the last lingering taste of ash. The smoke had cleared. The truth was out, and the job was done. That's all that ever really mattered. The next day, I was back. I didn't need to be, not really. The police and the federal agents had taken over the case against Harrison. But I always do a final walkthrough. It's my way of closing the file, of saying goodbye to the scene. The building was a black, hollowed-out shell against a bright, clear sky. The sounds of the city seemed to stop at the yellow tape line. Inside that perimeter, it was quiet. The only sound was the wind, whistling through the empty window frames on the upper floors. I had my small kit with me, but it was just habit. I was standing on the sidewalk, looking up at the 12th floor, when I heard him. "Dr. Hess?" I turned. It was Miller, the rookie. He wasn't in his heavy turnout gear. He was in his simple blue station uniform. He looked younger than I'd realized, and exhausted. He must have just come off a long shift. His hands were pushed deep into his pockets, and he stood a few feet away, shifting his weight. He looked uncertain, like a kid outside the principal's office. He looked at the pavement, then at my face. "Ma'am," he started, then corrected himself. "Dr. Hess, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." He finally met my eyes. They were clear and very serious. "For what I said," he continued, his voice quiet. "The other night, about the knitting circle and all of that. It was wrong. I was wrong." I looked at him for a long moment. He didn't flinch. He just stood there waiting. He wasn't the first young man to see me as nothing more than an old woman. He wouldn't be the last. But he was one of the very few who had ever come back to apologize. I gave him a small, tired smile. "Don't be sorry, firefighter," I said. He looked confused. "Be better." I turned to my car, which was parked at the curb, and popped the trunk. I placed my kit inside. "You looked at me," I said, not looking at him, "and you saw exactly what you expected to see. An old woman, a grandma. You didn't see me. I closed the trunk with a soft thud. That's the same mistake Mr. Harrison made. He looked at his problem and thought a big, loud, hot fire would make it go away. He expected everyone to be looking at the flames." I finally turned back to Miller. He was listening, really listening. He never thought there would be someone standing back, just watching the smoke. "Look past the obvious, firefighter. Look past the smoke and past your own assumptions. Never ever assume you know what you're looking at." I paused. "That's how you miss the truth." Every single time, he just nodded. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Yes, ma'am, Dr. Hess. Thank you." "Good," I said. I opened my car door. It was an old car, but the engine started with a quiet, reliable hum. I put it in gear, and as I pulled away from the curb, I looked at him one last time. He wasn't looking at me. He was standing on the sidewalk, his hands still in his pockets, staring up at the burned-out building. He was looking at it, but I could tell this time he was really seeing it.